Hello, it's Bob Wells here, and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. I hope you're well. Today's guest is Professor Stefan Kölsch. Stefan is an international leading neuroscientist and music psychologist. We're going to be talking about music, how we're able to unlock the healing power of music. Stefan's got a great book out called Good Vibrations, which I read prior to the interview, so that helped. The things we talk about, we do a bit of history, how music was used as healing practice for centuries, but it's only recently that we've begun to unravel the science behind music's profound impact on the mind and body. We hear about the groundbreaking research behind music's influence on human well-being. That's emotional, physical and psychological. And we begin with an account of the human brain's innate capacity for music. Stefan explains music's potential to evoke emotions, change our moods, soothe anxiety and alleviate pain. And he talks about some of the case studies, which are quite incredible, really. So there's plenty to talk about. I think you'll find this really interesting. And we all love music. We all know how it can make us feel better, particularly when we involve with other people as well, listening to music or playing music in my case. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy this show, and we'll welcome Stefan to the show. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Stefan.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on. We were saying before the recording, but you can't see the book at the moment. I've really enjoyed your book, Good Vibrations.
I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you.
What I found interesting was that, I mean, if I tell you some of my thoughts after having read the book, and I read the whole thing and finished actually this morning, the last 3 pages, the conclusion. My overall thoughts were, it was very, very well written. It was academic, but not academic to the point where somebody who is just a non-academic person can't read it. It was very easily readable. I learned so much, not just about music and the vibrations and all the healing benefits of it, but I learned so much about psychology. And the other sort of overriding impression was that it seems to be an area of interest and subject matter that, although it goes back some time, there seems to be a lot of stuff happening at the moment with it. And it's quite exciting for the future.
Yeah, well, I began my research about 25 years ago. Back then, there was basically no knowledge whatsoever, no studies about brain and music. So I started really with the most fundamental things about how the brain processes music. How do we perceive a wrong tone in a melody or in a chord sequence? Things like that. And from there, the second step was to investigate emotions in the brain, using music as a stimulus to evoke emotions. And from there, the next step was to investigate the therapeutic effects of music, because music evoked emotions and the therapeutic effects of music, they are closely linked with each other. And after decades of research in this area, what was very important for me was to make my research public in a way that everybody can understand what I'm doing and that everybody can benefit from the beneficial effects of music. Not just my colleagues, but everybody.
Well, you certainly accomplished that. And I'd like to talk about some of the subjects in the book a bit later on. But first of all, Stefan, I mean, you're a psychologist, a sociologist, a leading international neuroscientist, and a violinist. I mean, my big question is, I'd like to hear about your life growing up. But firstly, how have you accomplished so much?
Well, yeah, after I finished my violin studies, after I got my violin degree, I had health problems myself. And I, back then, realized how making music in very specific ways, other than the stressful ways that I had as a music student at conservatory, is good for my health and helps me regenerate and recuperate from the life-threatening condition that I had back then. And so that was around the last 1-2 years of my studies. So I wanted to finish my violin studies and then explore these experiences that I had with music being vital for my recovery and my health in a more scientific way. And that brought me to psychology and brain science. But what I missed in psychology was the fact that it's only centered at the individual. But we live in a social context, and if we want to heal, we have to also consider the societal context we live in. We can't expect music to heal us when we live in a society that makes us sick. So I got masters in sociology and psychology. I studied it in parallel because I, from my music studies, knew already how to study and how to study efficiently. So I relatively quickly got my master's in these two subjects and then did my PhD in neuroscience. Because during my psychology studies, so after the second year, I started at the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience in Leipzig, where I also studied. And that laid the groundwork for my research on music and the brain.
Well, thank you for that. Music therapy itself covers so much, doesn't it? And there's lots of different things that you covered in the book. What made you want to write the book in the first instance?
Yes, it was understanding the therapeutic effects of music, but way beyond that, understanding how does our brain work? How is music processed in the brain? How do emotions work? How do emotions work in the brain? Because this is all linked together. And I wanted to make the newest state of the art and of the knowledge available to everybody.
Tell us about the history of music therapy. Is it something that's just happened over the last few years? Does it go back centuries? How far back does it go?
Well, music therapy in itself has a decades-long tradition. We have to consider, though, that music therapy is not a research, not a heavily research or science-driven discipline. Of course, they rely on scientific findings and on research, but music therapists are, like, for example, physiotherapists or speech therapists, etc., first and foremost people who work practically, clinically with patients. And there were lots of case studies, lots of anecdotal reports, etc., but the field of the science of music therapy with studies according to the gold standards of science are relatively surprisingly recent. So that began really just around the turn of the century. So that is like 25, maybe 30 years ago, and has experienced an explosion in the last 10, 15 years, I would say. And it was important for me to now summarize, what do we know? What is the evidence base for which disorders, diseases can we actually say on good scientific grounds that music therapy and music can have beneficial effects?
Being a musician myself, I know that if I practice my guitar, even if it's for 20 minutes, in whatever state of mood I'm in, I feel great afterwards. I think it's partly meditative in as much as you're taken away from whatever you've been thinking about or doing, and you transfer, you put into a different environment, and you've just got the music. And I wanted to talk about the actual vibrations of music, because obviously, particularly when you're an adolescent, you refer to a Spotify study that found that people who listen to music that brings back memories, a lot of it goes back to the adolescent years when the dopamine's flowing, perhaps that first kiss or whatever. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. And as I say, you'd have to read the book to go, but are you able to summarize those findings?
Sure, I'm happy to. Memory and musical memory is a very curious phenomenon in the human brain because, for example, dementia patients, especially Alzheimer's patients, have a surprisingly well-preserved memory for music. I've seen Alzheimer patients who didn't recognize their own sister, but who still remembered music. They could still sing along with music, with the lyrics, and they even could learn new songs. Something that is difficult to explain in neurological and neuropsychological terms. And this intimate connection between music and memory is perhaps also associated with the intimate connection of music and emotion, because emotion is also in turn something that's closely linked with memory. Evolutionarily, the situations that were, for example, particularly pleasurable, particularly dangerous, particularly harmful, are the ones that we remember best, or that animals remember best, and they come with intense emotional experiences. And during adolescence, we all, as you already said, experience our first kiss, our first love, maybe the first sex, and the first close interactions with our peer group, etc. Things like that, things that are very emotional. And they are tied often to specific music that we heard back then. We identified with certain songs, our peer group identified with certain songs, our girlfriend and I maybe have a common song, etc. And because these are very emotional years, we tend to like these songs particularly well. We remember these songs particularly well, and on Spotify, we keep clicking on these songs. Of course, we also click on other songs. We click also on songs, of course, we can learn new preferences and can, begin to appreciate new styles and new genres, etc., etc. But on Spotify, there's this statistical phenomenon that people keep listening again and again to the songs that were published in their youth. For me, that was in the 80s. And, I keep listening songs, although I'm not particularly proud of which songs these are. Some of them was really good music back then. Yeah. AC/DC was big, so that was, I have a special connection to AC/DC. Back then, Wham! Was big. That is probably not something that I'm particularly proud of today, although very nicely produced songs, and George Michael, great artist and great singer. For me, as a classical violinist, it holds even for classical recordings. So, for example, Pinkas Zuckerman was a violinist who was, a star back then. Still is, but back then he was, a rising star, and I heard his CDs, recordings back then, which, I again and again, and still, those recordings are the best in my world. Pinkas Zuckerman is still one of the best violin players in my world. Yeah, there's a particular love I have for those recordings.
Yeah. And just a technical question on the actual listening of the music itself. Has any research been done into the difference between what you get benefits from live music compared with recorded music?
Well, there's not so much studies and evidence on this yet. I think what is important is how music affects us. And some of the effects we can get when we just listen to music, and some of the effects we can get only when we make music with others together. So, for example, when I play with other musicians together, let's say piano trio, I might not even know the pianist or the cellist with whom I play, but we play for 1 or 2 hours together, and we are all on a kind of high. It's probably an opioid high, because the brain produces endogenous opioids. Endorphins, for example, is one opioid that many know. And dopamine as well, you already mentioned that. I call that the fuel of the fun motor in the brain. And these neurochemicals can have therapeutic effects. Dopamine, for example, is a neurochemical that the brain releases to keep itself not only pleasurable, but young and healthy. The release of endogenous opioids is probably something that makes us happy, which also in turn has positive effects on our health. And this experience that many know who play music themselves is something that is difficult to get just from music listening. It's not impossible, because also music listening can move us to tears, evoke goosebumps, so strong emotional reactions. When we listen to an opera, let's say, or attend a concert where everybody knows the songs and everybody swings together emotionally, and maybe, you know, in a club or in a concert dance together, I think that's a very similar experience where people have this emotional high because they bond with each other through participation in the musical experience.
I was reading in your book about studies that had been done with children as young as 3 or 4, where they learn a musical instrument, and the playing of the music enhances part of the brain that's connected with language, which then leads on to improvement in their learning when they go to school. Could you say a few words about that, please, Stefan?
Yes, well, back then when I started as a young student, the view was, well, there's language in the brain, there's music in the brain, and they don't really have to do anything with each other. And this view has been revolutionized during the last decades. So now it's become clear that there's one network in the brain that I refer to as the music-language network that produces both language and music. Of course, there are certain differences. Language is processed more in the left hemisphere, music more in the right. But it's striking that there's a huge overlap in the neural resources for music and language. And that maybe, makes sense, because when we speak, we speak with a melody and with a rhythm, with a certain timbre, all musical features. And when we listen to music, there are also structural relations between the notes, the chords, similar to the relations of the structure of words in a sentence. So there's a certain overlap. Of course, music and language are not simply the same. Language has specific meanings. We talk in order to convey, for example, who did what to whom. That is something that music doesn't need. Music instead needs a pulse, let's say, and a scale so that everybody can participate. But this overlap in neural resources back then motivated us to investigate whether the training of these resources with music might lead to an improvement of language abilities. And indeed, we saw that children who received musical training from early on have a better developed language. And studies after that found that, for example, children with specific language impairment can benefit from music interventions, especially interventions that focus on rhythm, clapping together, singing and clapping together, moving to music. The reports that are out there, the studies, show that the effects of the music interventions are just as good in children with language impairment than speech interventions. And this is very important because once these children get into school, they are at a huge disadvantage if they have language impairment, because they don't understand well what is said in class, they can't participate as well as the others, etc. So delayed speech development during preschool years is often linked with learning difficulties then in the first school years. And even in patients, we can use these phenomena. So, for example, patients who, after a stroke in the left anterior part of the brain, often get a so-called Broca's aphasia. It's an aphasia where you can't speak anymore. They can understand you, but they can't talk anymore. However, they can still sing with words. So they can't say happy birthday to you, but they can sing happy birthday to you. And I've seen patients singing happy birthday to you so clearly that it was difficult to believe that they can't speak this sentence. And music therapy, in specific the so-called melodic intonation therapy, can use this phenomenon to work with patients in a way, especially those with chronic aphasia, that they learn speaking via singing. So instead of saying, I am thirsty, they start with I am thirsty. And then week by week, they make a transition from singing these sentences to speaking these sentences. Works for many people with stuttering and other types of speech difficulties as well.
And we'll talk a bit later on about all the benefits in terms of certain illnesses and states of being, and there are lots. But I'd just like to go back to people listening to music together, and I was astounded by this, and I think we've all felt atmospheres when we've gone into places, but we give off chemicals when listening to music.
Yeah, well, that is linked to emotions. When we experience emotions, it's associated with the release of certain chemicals via our sweat glands. One of the evolutionary purposes of this was, for example, to signal to our conspecifics what is going on. And indeed, there is a very interesting study where they measured the chemicals in the air of a cinema theater and found out that during more humorous, amusing, pleasurable episodes, the chemical composition of the air was different than in episodes of the movie that were scary and frightening to the audience.
That's quite amazing.
Yes. And of course, we can imagine that the same happens in the opera, in the concert hall, in the club. And I think it is something that subliminally, unconsciously, we even cherish when we go and experience music together with others, in a crowd, because this shared emotional experience is usually stronger than experiencing emotions alone. And of course, the swinging together is maybe one of the most important aspects here, but also, the flair, the atmosphere that we can breathe with our nose in these instances contributes to this experience.
Yeah, I think that was a recurring theme in the book that I noticed, was that coupled with the music itself is the ability to have social contact continually, and even going into dance as well. Those three things can assist.
I think that's even one of the main evolutionarily adaptive functions of music, to bring people together, to support and foster community. There's this fascinating phenomenon that when people synchronize with each other, they feel socially more bonded. And this synchronization can be to a pulse, for example, where in experiments individuals clap together to a metronome, and afterwards they help each other more. They cooperate more with each other. They feel more strongly connected with each other. And we see these effects already in preschool children. Preschool children help each other more when they danced around a pond to music in an experiment. And these pro-social functions of music are not only important for us as social beings and, during the course of evolution, but they come along with a specific class of positive emotions, namely emotions that we experience as happiness, not just only as pleasure, but in addition also as something that makes us happy. And therefore I think music is such a powerful vehicle, not only to bond us together, but also to elicit experiences of happiness.
Yeah, and that goes on to something else that you mentioned in the book, was how music can be used to diffuse conflicts. And you use the example of, and they still do it, hunter-gatherer tribes, where they, the opposing sides will sing together, sometimes with a bit of satire, etc., and hopefully diffuse the tensions.
Yes, and apparently that's a universal phenomenon. It's observed around the globe in hunter-gatherer cultures. So there must be something in our human genes to use music in this way. There are also still, for example, hip-hop traditions where a very similar practice is supposed to mitigate conflicts. And there are many other cultural phenomena where dancing together, certain kinds of sports together where you synchronize together are supposed to reduce conflicts.
I'd like to talk about the actual music itself, and in particular major and minor chords. I think most listeners will be aware that if they're listening to a song that is sad, it's likely that the chords are going to be minor chords. Whereas if they're listening to a song that is probably more upbeat and positive, it will be major chords. And so then I was thinking, well, should I only really be listening to major chord music? Because that way I'll get more positivity and benefit in my life. Whereas if I listen to a sad song, and you mentioned this with people with depression, it can actually exasperate how they actually feel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's major and minor key of a song. I think it's more the way that the tone of the music, the character of the music imitates an emotional voice or emotional speech. So, for example, everybody can recognize from my voice when I'm sad because I speak with less energy and more slowly and more with less brightness in my frequency register. Whereas when I'm happy, the speech melody goes up and down, and I speak faster, and there's more energy and more high frequency components, etc. And that is often something that music that tries to express a certain emotion mimics. The acoustic features are actually exactly the same for these kinds of emotional expression in language or speech. When we listen to a sad song, it's not necessarily a minor song. So, for example, Tears in Heaven, which was voted as one of the saddest songs ever, is actually in major. And let's also not forget that songs usually consist of many chords, not just of one chord. And these many chords are typically about half major and about half minor chords, irregardless of whether the main key of a song is major or minor. There are also many cultures where festive songs are actually in minor keys, but you would hardly recognize because it's so upbeat and uplifting and happy sounding.
Okay, well that's something that was new to me, because I automatically thought if it's in a minor key, it's going to be a sad song.
No, that is often not the case. In classical music, often the more sad pieces are set in minor. In minor key, but even there are exceptions.
For people that don't really have the opportunity or don't particularly desire to listen to classical music, what would you say the benefits are if they start to listen to classical music in addition to popular music?
I think it's the same benefits that somebody who usually listens to classical music gets from listening to more modern music, let's say jazz, good pop music, etc. I think it's just widening your repertoire and your spectrum.
I was listening to some classical music this morning. You inspired me to listen to some more, and I was listening to, I think it was some Bach harpsichord music, and I found that particularly uplifting. And you mentioned that music can be used for almost like a meditation. I mentioned earlier on about playing how I play the guitar most days, and 10 or 15, 20 minutes, and it does put me into a different world. But I'd like you to talk, if you don't mind, to talk about how music can be used as almost like a meditation.
Yes, I think using music like a meditation is very powerful to get some of the most beneficial effects out of music, of the good vibrations of music. We can, on the one hand, focus on music while we play an instrument. And as you already said, it can be very meditative when we really focus on what we are doing, we're listening on what we're playing, and we do not allow our minds to wander, especially not into negative territories. When I was a music student, I made most of my music studies myself to hell, because when I was practicing, my mind was always going like, wrong tone here, wrong tone there, not good enough, others are so much better, you will never catch up with them. All these negative, destructive thoughts, instead of focusing on the positive, focusing on the tones that actually were correct, the many ones, and the progress that I had made during the last weeks and months. And these negative thought loops, and clinically called rumination, not only make our lives to a hell, but they are unhealthy for us, because they interfere with our immune system, with our organ activity via the so-called autonomic nervous system. They impede on our hormonal system. And on the other hand, when we switch off these negative thought loops and let the good vibrations of music resonate in us, then the biological healing powers of our body have room to breathe again and to unfold. So while playing an instrument, just focusing on the playing is a great way of meditation. In psychology, we call this attention-focused meditation. I wish somebody had told me that when I was a music student. That would have made my music studies, much more healthy and pleasurable and effective. However, we do not even have to be a musician to benefit this way from music, because even just listening to music, we can employ a similar recipe. So, for example, not just listen to music in the background, but somehow engage actively with the music. And that can be as simple as just tapping along the beat of the music. What I often do is I tap along the beat and I breathe out and breathe in synchrony or synchronized to the musical beats. And while breathing, I count the beats of the music. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And by doing so, our attention is focused on the music. At the same time, the positive mood of the music can resonate in us. It will resonate with our emotions, and it will change our mood. It will disrupt our negative thought loops, our rumination, and this will have instant regenerative effects in our brain and in our body. So already just a few minutes can give our brain, an emotional timeout that can reset negative thoughts and negative moods in a way that we, get in a brighter mood and more positive thoughts. And this is, of course, not only important for healthy people, it's particularly important for patients with disorders and diseases, especially mental health conditions, because most mental health conditions are tied to these intrusive, repetitive, negative thoughts. Depression, for example. The feelings of guilt in post-traumatic stress disorder. The flashbacks in post-traumatic stress disorder. The negative, unpleasant voices in schizophrenia spectrum disorder. The thoughts about something not being right in obsessive-compulsive disorder. The thoughts about something that might be scary in pathological anxiety. The list goes on and on and on and on. And in all of these conditions, we can use music very simply and effectively by just putting something on that sounds like the mood that we want to get into, and then somehow engaging with it. We can even use it to reduce acute and chronic pain, just all with the same recipe.
It's fantastic, and we you mentioned all those different things. The various illnesses and states of being: strokes, dementia, Parkinson's, chronic pain, addiction, sleep disorders, depression, and I named a few there. I mean, it goes on and on. The other thing that I found very interesting was that young musicians themselves tend to have, when they've done the analysis, have the youngest brain age, which is caused by dopamine. And, dopamine's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's very much a sort of get-you-going chemical. But then you get the argument that if you're not careful, you can have too much dopamine. How do you know what the right amount of dopamine is to have?
Well, the dopamine is released in various systems in the brain. And one of them is a system that's integral to what I refer to as the pleasure system in the brain, where dopamine is released into the fun motor in the brain, as I call it. And yes, there are rare instances where there can be too much, but most mental health conditions are characterized by a lack of sufficient dopamine in this very system. So, for example, in depression, especially when it's accompanied in these episodes of pleasurelessness, where people have problems to perceive pleasure, but also schizophrenia. You mentioned Parkinson's. That's a dementia that is characterized by the lack of dopamine in this region. I already mentioned obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, the list is very long, and therefore the vision here is that we have more studies showing that music interventions and engagement in music, for example, in the way that I just described, can help these patients release dopamine again in this system, and therefore kind of balance out the dopamine dysregulation that is in part at the root of their health condition.
You go, as I said before, you go into a lot of the detail with the best way for people to be treated for these various disorders. And I was thinking there seems to be a merging with speech therapy and music therapy. They almost like come together at a certain point. So, you know, if one was a music therapist, then you could argue that if you're a speech therapist, you would be advised to know a little bit about music therapy as well, because it might form part of your armory in helping tackle some of the issues. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I can only underline this very strongly, because when you're working with children with delayed language development, then there are many recipes, and I describe some of them also in the book, how to work with these children with music, how to help these children with music. Same for physiotherapists. I mean, many physiotherapists already use music. Often the music is in the background, or they ask the patient to do certain exercises, and, you know, without any instruction, the patient starts doing the exercises along to the musical beat. But physiotherapists can be more aware about the potential effects that this can have, and how they can actually utilize these effects and really harvest them for the benefit of the patients. For example, really bring the patients to synchronize, ideally in a group, to a certain beat with certain movements.
It's interesting, isn't it? You look at primitive societies. I say primitive, I only mean it in as much as they didn't have the technology that we've got. But some of those hunter-gatherer tribes, and almost any excuse to have a bit of a party and a sing seems to be ingrained in their culture.
Yeah, the fascinating phenomenon is that every culture that we know has music. By the way, every culture that we know has music and language, and that shows us that not only language is universal, music is also universal.
Yeah.
The fact that every culture that we know, including all hunter-gatherer cultures, have music also shows us how deeply ingrained music is in our DNA, in our human DNA, in how much music is part of us as a human species.
For people listening to this podcast, and they're lucky enough not to be suffering from a particular ailment that we've already discussed, but they just want resilience for life and ongoing well-being. Two questions, really. How important is it for them to listen to music? And the second question is, what would you advise them to do to enhance the quality of their life and resilience going forward?
Yes. Well, music is certainly not the only tool that you can use for your resilience. There are many others, but those who like music can use the power of music to attract attention, to shift moods, to change thoughts, etc. All these effects that I describe in the book. And maybe one aspect that I would like to mention here is that many people think that they cannot really manage emotions and moods, because in our culture we have this notion that, you know, things happen and then, you know, it's natural to have an emotional response in a certain way. But that is rarely true. the emotions are generated in our brains, and we can often see things differently. Often, we don't need to be angry about what happened, because most of the times our anger is about, trivial, irrelevant things.
Yeah.
Why is it necessary to be angry when my wife puts the dishes wrong in the dishwasher? Or is it necessary to be angry when the husband puts the dishes again in the sink and not directly in the dishwasher? All these little things. We can see things differently, and we can manage our emotions. And the more we learn this in our everyday life, the better we are equipped to deal once crisis strikes. So once we witness something horrible, once we have a severe life crisis and the like, when we have a history, a years-long history of, for example, using music to manage our emotions, to manage our negative thoughts and thought loops, to manage our moods, then we are much better equipped to deal with crises and severely, potentially traumatizing events. And while doing that, not only do we increase our resilience, we also do something good for our health, because the positive emotions, positive thoughts are integral for not only for our well-being, but also for our health.
Fascinating. And you mentioned about the hippocampus in our brain being is almost like the manager of our happiness system. And particularly for people who suffer from severe depression, some of the if they listen to music, it can actually stimulate the introduction of new cells.
That is right. The hippocampus, that I also refer as the happiness system or the happiness center in the brain, is part of what many know as the limbic system. The limbic system is a system in the brain that is important for emotions and for memory. And the hippocampus is the only part in the brain that has a small layer of cells that can actually produce new stem cells that can then migrate into the hippocampus and develop into nerve cells. And on the one hand, this hippocampus, the structure that I also call the soul in the brain, is highly vulnerable. It's the only structure in the brain where neurons can die as a result of severe chronic emotional stress, severe violence, for example. But fortunately, this volume loss in the hippocampus that we can see in anatomical MRI images can also be reverted by neurodegeneration in this part of the brain.
You've got a suggested playlist halfway through the book. So if you listen and perhaps even dance to 30 songs during the month, it can have a really good effect on your body. What feedback have you had on that?
Yes, so far mostly positive, luckily. The thing is that this playlist includes dance songs from the last 100 years. So it's from many different epochs and styles and genres, and the purpose was that there's something for everybody. And that might also explain that people, even if they don't like one song, they play the other one instead.
Yeah, no, I found that really good. I mean, it would be nice to have. I was thinking myself, one could put your own, make it, and I think you suggest it, create your own, say, Spotify playlist. So you could have one playlist for wanting to feel adventurous, another one for if you're a bit sad, feeling a bit better, and all that sort of thing. I know one song that really gets me going, and that's Summer, the Four Seasons, Vivaldi.
I have played that one, yes, and it's a very lively piece. And many people find this very stimulating and brightening up the mood. I provided many examples in my book for pieces that can, for example, motivate us, energize us, calm us down, brighten our mood, etc. But in the end, it's always the most important music choice is personal. So the important thing is how music affects you personally. Because I might find classical music uplifting and conducive to my concentration and to my positive for my mood, whereas somebody else who might be more into dark metal music might find it distressful, and then another person might say, yeah, but that dark metal music seems very stressful and aggressive to me, and then the dark metal enthusiast says, well, to me not at all. For me it's motivating. I find it amusing. I know these guys. They are really, they played with tongue in the cheek, and I can get up with this music in the morning, and it keeps me going when I feel tired, etc.
Yeah,
I think an important point is that sooner or later we end up with songs that sound like the mood that we want to get into. Many people stick with songs that sound like the negative mood that they're currently in, without then making a transition to sounds that sound like the mood that they want to get into. And for some people it's fine to, for example, let's say after a breakup, cry yourself out and vent with some sad sounding music, and then they go on listening to more happy music again. That's fine. But individuals with depression or individuals with tendency to depression, they keep sticking with these negative sounding songs because they say, well, it fits with my current mood. I don't feel alone with my problems. I feel understood. And then they keep listening to these, depressive sounding or sad sounding music. For those, it's important to assemble playlists where piece by piece you can make a transition to music that sounds like the mood that you want to get into. It can start with the music that typically sounds like, or that sounds like the music that you feel when you're typically, in a negative state.
Yeah. So move yourself into the frame of mind, the atmosphere that you want to be in.
Exactly. And for others, others can, there are also people who say, well, even if I'm in a sad mood, what helps me most is just put on some positive music, and then I make the transition most easily. So that's all fine.
I've got a left field question now, I play the guitar, the electric guitar, and it's all about seeing music in colour. And I was a big fan of Thin Lizzy, who were a band that had a lot of harmony guitars in. And every time I was listening to the two guitars in harmony, so one would be a third down, I was almost seeing it in colour. Is that me going loopy, or is that a well-known phenomenon?
It's a well-known phenomenon. It's called synesthesia. Some have it with keys, some have it with intervals, some have it with certain harmonies, some have it with numbers, and there are even more, different instances. I have never done research on this myself because the variation between different individuals with synesthesia is very large. So if you might see brown when you hear a certain harmony, and another one might hear green. So it was always very difficult for me to really devise an experiment. It's also not so easy to find enough individuals who are willing to take part in such a study.
This is such a fascinating conversation, Stefan. If we've got any listeners who want to know a bit more about, say they would like to, well, first of all about you, but if they want to consider a career in speech, in music therapy or studying it, what would you suggest to them?
Well, seek out a university that offers a bachelor or a master's or a combined program, make a degree and become a music therapist. And of course, during the studies, have a look at the book, Good Vibration.
Of course, I was going to say, it's a unique book, fantastic book. And the book's widely available in all good bookstores and Amazon, I guess.
Yes, well, I hope so. It's certainly available via Amazon, and I hope more and more bookstores will get it.
Well, Stefan, it's been great talking to you and learning so much about this exciting subject. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show. My guest today is Stefan Kölsch. Stefan is an internationally leading neuroscientist and music psychologist. And you can find details about Stefan's book, Good Vibrations, in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Stefan.
It was a big pleasure. Thank you.